I'm Daniel Eyre. I'm the Vice President for Business Development at Seracor International. As you can see, I've been around the block a little bit. To go into a little bit more detail about my NHS experience, I've worked for Manchester Foundation Trust, as was Rotherham, Pennine Acute, Yorkshire and Humber CSU, again, as was, and also worked for Connecting for Health for a number of years. So I've got a lot of experience within the healthcare sector, as you can see across my experience. And one of the things I'm going to do today is share some of that experience and share some of that knowledge, not just within service management, but program management and the system as a whole. I'll quickly cover some of what Seracor do. As you can see from on the screen, we do help desk support. We were recently judged very highly in class for our service management and service desk infrastructure. We've helped the UK within the EPR implementations of places like Liverpool Women's, Alderhay, and working with HCA from a private organisation perspective. We also do lots of other services like IT advisory, security, cloud services, help implement ServiceNow within organisations as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how technology is used within care models and within healthcare within the UK. So as you can see from this little bit of a diagram, that using technology is really integral with how resources, how care models are delivered. And that being used within how we actually fundamentally make care models work within the industry. And the CIO being part of that strategic thinking around how we can best use some of these within the remit of what we're doing. Traditionally, what we've been doing is sort of what we can say around fiddling around the edges. And, the famous quote on screen, "It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it," looking at how we put those different organizations, different resources, different care models. Not most of us that are on this call that have been in and around healthcare for a number of years will know the changes that have happened around organizations. ICS has been one of the latest ones, and all of the different changes to try and affect this model. But I wanted to touch on some of the preconceived ideas about what the NHS is and what resources it's got. So is one of the problems that we have in the NHS at the moment, is it around funding? Well, I suppose it's not. If you look at some of the diagrams on the screen, you can see that the amount of money that we spend as a GDP reference is pretty much in the middle. Obviously there's a slight outlier with the US, but with other comparable size countries like Germany, Canada, etc., we spend about the same as a GDP. The amount that we spend per head is, again, around about middling for our size. So if we're spending around the same sort of money, is it something else? Is it resources? And again, you look at these diagrams, and actually the UK is around about the middle of the pack again. There is obvious outliers with Germany that you can see on the right-hand side around hospital beds, and just the way that they function as an organisation, as a healthcare system, is one of the reasons why they're an outlier. But from the UK's perspective, the amount of physicians that we have, the amount of nurses that we have, is pretty much on par with everybody else. So if it's not resources, is it rurality? Now, one of my colleagues talked about Paris earlier on, and that's actually, the most rural area within the UK that the health service services And as you can see, that's about 25 people per square kilometre. Within England itself, we're not very rural. There's lots of other examples, like Western Australia, where there's one person per kilometre. But they have a functioning health service that performs better than ourselves. So it's not necessarily rurality that's the issue. Is demographics a problem? And again, we're sitting pretty much in the middle of the pack. There is some slight outliers, but our average population is about the same as everybody else. So it's not money, it's not resources, it's not where we live from a rurality perspective or the type of population that we're dealing with. What is some of the issues? And I'll talk about a little bit about service management in the NHS as well. And some of the current state around that service management, some of my colleagues talked earlier on about there's centralized control, there's limited patient involvement in some of those services and how those services are delivered and the decision making within those services. A lot of siloed systems. So traditionally we've had district general hospitals working in a very different way to primary care, mental health, community. And I know that's slightly different within Wales, but certainly very siloed systems. So if it isn't what you do, it's the way that you do it, what do we need to do to change things? Now, the NHS was founded in 1948. Other sectors and industries have dramatically transformed. And I'm not saying that we should transform ourselves into banking, for example. But if you look at banking as as an example of how they've changed from that location-based model to much more of an IT-focused virtual model, that has been done for two reasons. One, for convenience sake for users, for things like being able to access your funds wherever you are, whenever you are, via mobile devices and things like that. I'm of a generation where I went to the bank with my dad, who cashed a check on a weekly basis, and that was the money for the week. You couldn't go to a cash point. You couldn't transfer money in convenient ways. Again, I'm of a generation where I went to Blockbusters to get a video on a Friday night. Now you can stream and Netflix on-demand services. So all of these institutions have moved on, but the NHS hasn't really moved on in those years. And in some following slides, I'll suppose what needs to happen around those particular services. So to give you a little bit of an overview of what is considered the 20th century care model, with secondary care sitting in the middle of primary care and tertiary care. And what we've done is looked at decentralization from secondary care and certainly around into primary care, and centralization into tertiary care. And that's the model that we've been looking at and been dealing with from a 20th century perspective. With the acute sector being at the centre of that. And is that viable moving forward? What do we need to do? Because we've all seen in the news, ambulances waiting outside A&E, the fact that there isn't enough beds in the hospital. So having secondary care at the centre of and the largest organisation isn't necessarily the function that we need moving forward. So having that split into a different working model. So some of you might have heard of virtual wards, hospital at home, as some people refer it to, looking at that different model of remote consultations, remote monitoring, wearables, smart homes, getting that workforce into a different structure than that traditional 20th century model of everybody working in a acute hospital in an acute hospital setting. One of the key things is around having the GP as the gatekeeper role over your healthcare interaction, and things like referrals all needing to happen from the primary care setting. We're relatively unique in the UK that we have that GP role as your gatekeeper, and you should be able to access your healthcare in anywhere within this cycle, not just having to contact a GP, then having them make a referral is a lot more work than is not necessarily needed within the GP sector. So the 20th century model was initially designed based um, on transactional type medicine. And what I mean by that is you would get, let's say, TB or an infection that could be dealt with in a hospital. You went into hospital, you got treatment, you were then discharged from hospital. It was a very transactional basis, and you were sick and then you were well. Now, most of those transactional diseases are being eradicated or transforming into long-term chronic disease management. And that means that the system that was designed on being able to do a transaction with a particular patient needs to move into that management of long-term conditions. So it's not just about you turning up to hospital, them doing something and you being discharged. There needs to be, throughout the whole of the care pathway, interactions with different systems. And we're not currently set up to deal with that in a very efficient way. So what is it that is happening within the wider healthcare setting? And I've given a few examples here around different countries doing different things in a very different way. You know, one of the examples here is around the USA that's doing assertive outreach, and that's where they're looking at a clinical incident where a patient actually arrives at hospital. If they're managed outside of the hospital, for example, you're managing the diabetes long-term condition, if they end up in hospital with diabetic retinopathy or some issues around diabetes, that they deal with that as a clinical incident because they're trying to manage the patient outside of the hospital, and them turning up to hospital and taking up a bed means that they failed somewhere in that path. Now, there's obvious exceptions to that where there's things like car accidents or things like that, but where there's long-term management and of conditions, looking at how we interject into that care pathway to make sure that they don't end up at the most expensive place, which is the hospital in a hospital bed. There's other areas like Japan that are leading the way on aged care. Australia, because of the rurality, is leading on rural healthcare. One of the most surprising things on here is that Estonia are leading the way around electronic health and how everything is managed through an e-health system. So I think there's definitely some examples where we can look at other systems that are dealing with things in probably a better way than we are ourselves. So looking at the future of healthcare, there is already the start of some of this journey. You know, social care integration, assertive outreaches, remote monitoring, online consultations. You know, online consultations obviously blew up as part of COVID, but I don't think we've taken that to the next step. You know, smart homes and the technology around smart homes has been around for a number of years, but using that to make sure that we've got enough patients that can be treated at home, and the best place for them is at home. It is definitely something that we don't take full advantage of. There's a quote at the bottom there around, you know, we talk about beds in hospitals and, you know, do we have enough beds? What's the utilization of beds? And there's a quote here that sort of highlights where we need to be looking at. There is enough beds in this country. They're in everybody's homes. And if that bed is the best place for them, why aren't they in that bed? So shifting to some of the IT service management future trends, much more patient-centric IT service management, because of the way that we're shifting to patient portals, digital health portals. There will be a need to manage all of those applications. We've seen that within the NHS app. There will be much more management of those services that are digitally focused, and ideally much more wide-reaching than just being a particular location-based. Obviously, as most people know, cloud-based solutions are taking the forefront of a cloud-first model within the NHS, and that gives scalability, flexibility, and standardization. And I think that's one of the key things within service management. Some of my colleagues talked about communities and being able to have that. Somebody has done it before. How do we take that standardized approach with that flexibility where it's needed, but making sure that we're following the good practices? And a lot of these technologies around cloud-based solutions, SaaS platforms, etc., give you that ability to scale and do standardizations. Talked about data security and the measures to be able to not only protect patients' information, but one of my colleagues mentioned earlier about help desks being targeted, making sure that we're securing data that may have some patient identifiable information, but also may have staff information, because that's as important as patient information, and we shouldn't forget that. To get rid of some of the silos in the way that we're working, making sure that the importance of interoperability in data exchanges, being able to pass help desk tickets across organizations seamlessly, being able to access different information seamlessly across organizations is going to become more and more important. And again, as we've talked about, the emphasis on user experience and being able to make sure that those end users of the service get the quality of the service that they expect, and being able to really interact with those applications in the best way possible. So what does it all mean for healthcare systems? So I think dramatically we need to change the focus on proactive identification and support of those chronic diseases. Some people have talked about the federated data platform around population health, and how that is really trying to look at how we deal with different healthcare needs and identify those early on to be able to help support and manage those. Being able to have patients, families and carers be their primary agents in care. So gone are the days where everything the doctor says is taken as gospel. Being able to have family members that help with that understanding of that care pathway for elderly relatives, for example. A lot more investment at home monitoring systems, hospital at home or virtual wards is one of the key ways that the NHS will be able to get rid of bed blocking within the healthcare system. Being able to improve our outpatients and domiciliary assessment services is again going to be one of the key things that we need to, and that working together with social care and other tertiary care services that allows us to manage people outside of the hospital in a much more efficient way. The health service in general is only going to get more strain on it, and tweaking around the edges is not going to make those fundamental changes. We need to look at it in a completely different system where that ill health will be inevitable for all of us, and the advances in medicine itself have caused the shift in how we need to look at the healthcare system in general. So what does that mean for us in particular? And one of the things I talk about on different forums is around having data and that data architecture in place of what data do we have, why do we need it, and what is its main use. And having that in place allows you to look at anywhere within the system, whether that be from a service management perspective, a patient perspective, looking at what is the underlying data, not necessarily the system and the electronic patient record, for example. It's why are we collecting that data and what's the benefit for the patient and what's the benefit for the system? And if you don't have that in place, quite often you're just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. You need to look at what is the underlying basis to help transform that. And the federated data platform and other systems allow that to happen. Looking at organizations and ensuring their information systems support proactively and helping not just from an IT service management perspective, but cross-sector, cross-boundary working to enable those systems to be able to seamlessly allow people that either patients or users of the systems themselves to be able to work in an efficient and effective way. There's lots of stuff that we need to do within the health service, and there's a long way to go, but I think one of the key things is about having those conversations, having that community to be able to look at how can we make a difference, what can we do, what is the long-term goal for this, and how do we get there? And that's one of the key things, and why days like today are really important to start some of those discussions. So that's the end of my presentation. I do have my contact details there if you want to discuss anything further or work with Seracor in any way moving forward. Stop sharing now.
Thanks very much, Dan. It's a really interesting perspective, and to be able to see it from an international point of view as well, and to make some of those comparisons between our health service and where the priorities lie in other countries is quite fascinating.